Hello, I'm Patrick Boyer speaking to you from Bracebridge Public Library in this series of podcasts dealing with themes of war, as I've outlined in my first book in a series of modern history of Muskoka, dealing with the Great War, which of course was not great because it was wonderful or good. It was called great because it was huge and all-encompassing. 8 empires around the world totally involved in conflict on all fronts. Muskokans particularly, though, because we were in the war at Britain's behest, the sentiment of so many Muskokans who were loyal to the British Empire, and monarchists, and focused on whatever Britain was doing as expanding their horizons beyond this small bit of backwater Canada, colonial Canada. They saw through the Union Jack fluttering over the flagpoles at Muskoka schools and community halls, a much wider empire of which they were proudly part. And so in that pride and that sentiment, they referred to Britain, the imperial power, as the mother country. Well, when mother went to war, she took her children with her. And so in 1914, Muskokans, although they were unaware really of the fundamental issues between the European imperial powers, loyally clicked their heels, saluted, and fell in line because they had no other choice, frankly, than to go to war on behalf of the British Empire. This podcast is going to look at the role of Muskoka's women in times of war. Because the Great War was a time of huge transformation that enabled women to actually do both traditional women's work in new ways and to move out into important jobs in the economy, commerce, and society that were vacated by the men going overseas. This is the cover of my book that we're basing a lot of these podcasts on. And you see the front cover, that's Muskoka's overseas battalion marching through over the bridge at Port Carling, about 900 men strong, heading off to war. A lot of them were farmers. Agriculture was a huge part of the Canadian economy over a century ago. Well, when the men leave their farms and go to war, women are left to do the farm work. Women had always, from the first days of settlement in Muskoka, been part of the farming scene. But now the full onus of planting and tending crops and getting in the harvest fell to women. As did all the other jobs in the tanneries, the woolen mills, the stores, commerce, retail operations, offices, so many areas that women were moving into because it was essential work that had to be carried on to maintain the home front while also supporting the war effort. And this was a time that women were actually able to realize new opportunities. That was important because in 1914, the world in which Muskoka women found themselves was totally designed and built by men. Men were making the laws in Parliament and the legislature and municipal councils, and they were only elected by men. In banking and other realms of commerce, only men held those positions. The law was enforced by policemen. And through all sorts of other social structures, women found themselves, in a tight fit of rules and social norms established by men. In fact, even on many of the tombstones and in the obituaries, when a woman died, her remains were buried or the obituary printed, it referred to her as a relic of her husband. Relic. And when their names were printed in the paper, the only difference between her husband's name and hers was that instead of an MR in front of the name, it was MRS. Women's identity, in other words, was totally within the context of a male society. The Great War helped change that. It created upheaval on a grand scale, and in that chaos were opportunities for women to realize their potential to a much greater extent in economic power and indeed political power, winning the right to vote during the First World War, both provincially and nationally. Now, when the war broke out, Muskoka was lightly populated, still is, but even then more so. There were at most 3,000 men eligible for active military service. And when they were gone, even more would still be taken once the forestry units were established. They didn't require the same level of physical fitness or height or so on. And men who were seasoned foresters also left. And then came conscription, with more Muskokans being taken out, all of which created a vacuum in which women began to play a very active role. The term that emerged during the Great War was the home front in relation to the military front overseas. And in fact, the two became tied together in a way that really made them two sides of the same coin. With transatlantic cable, with steel-hulled ships shortening the distance, steam-powered, much quicker back and forth across the Atlantic than with sailing ships, wind-powered, and with film footage showing what was happening overseas, the distance became much closer, less separated. The impressions and also the emotions of those who were working on the home front, mostly women, with those men who didn't go overseas, and their soldiers, the loved ones who were in uniform and along the Western Front. So this bond really became an important aspect of how the Muskoka women were able to become the head and the heart and the bone and the sinew of the home front's effort. They did so many different things, and part of it was just communication with the soldiers. For first example, that from its beginning, even with that distance being closed up, it was unlike today when a woman in Bracebridge or Huntsville or anywhere else in our district has someone in the Canadian Forces serving overseas on any mission, United Nations mission or otherwise, with NATO. There can be constant communication by telephone and email and so on. Not in 1914 to 1918, when your husband, son, father, brother, uncle, lover, fiance went overseas, you were not going to be seeing him for 3 or 4 years, if at all. So the mails were really the only means of communication, and letters just poured forth. And the Borden government had also introduced parcel post early in 1914, prior to the war, which became also indispensable for shipping over the care packages that were being produced by Muskoka women. All the socks and scarves that were being knitted, the pajamas that were being made, the wound dressings that were being sewn, as well as the baked goods, durable fruit cakes that would withstand the shipment across the ocean and delivery to the front. All of these items being shipped, along with loving letters and clippings from the local newspapers, ensured that there was this huge transatlantic communication. That was just part of the home front effort. however, the more active role saw women moving into new roles in raising money, for example. And some of it was through traditional methods like sewing and baking that would pretty much fell to women's domain, but in new ways. Signature, those who like to make quilts found that a good way to raise money was to sell signature quilts, meaning that a person would pay money to have his or her name sewn into a quilt, and then when all the squares on the quilt were completed, it would be auctioned off. And the end result was netting money for the war effort. The Clef Club in Bracebridge, which had started in 1908 as 4 music teachers in the town, all women, got this private Clef Club, Clef the musical denotation, to play music for themselves. And other women joined them. But all their performances were in private for their own entertainment and amusement and pleasure. With the advent of the war, they began performing publicly, giving concerts, charging admission. And the Clef Club of Bracebridge raised enough money in this manner to actually buy an ambulance for the Muskoka Overseas Battalion. Here's a picture of it, sitting outside Muskoka District Courthouse on Dominion Street. It's not really understood today how citizens would be raising money to buy military equipment or even medical equipment for our services, our soldiers serving overseas. We expect fully that the Canadian government would be doing that. But even in Gravenhurst, where the town council opened up its council chamber in the Opera House so that women of Gravenhurst, especially those in the Gravenhurst chapter of the Red Cross, could meet there and package up care packets to ship overseas. They raised money and spent their own money buying at local pharmacies in Gravenhurst all sorts of medical supplies that in the rush to get soldiers overseas hadn't been included in the packs of in the supplies for the soldiers. There were many ways like that the civilian society on the home front was supporting the war effort and the soldiers. On the more military side of that, the women were looking after the warmth and the clothing needs, the eating needs, the medical needs of the soldiers, but the councils were buying machine guns. $1,000 for a Vickers machine gun. And this was done through, from Port Carling to Huntsville and Bracebridge. Bracebridge also bought a lot of tents for the soldiers, equipment that civil society was providing for the war effort. Well, food became scarce as the war went on. There was rationing, and then there was foodstuffs that were simply no longer available, even on the black market. Coupons were issued to those who were buying food because that is how rationing was controlled. And as the weeks and months went by, the local newspapers, the Huntsville Forester, the Muskoka Herald in Bracebridge, the Bracebridge Gazette, the Gravenhurst Banner, all published what the government was issuing as alternatives to flour and coffee and tea and many other items that were no longer available or only in limited supplies. And recipes were being issued, and housewives were pooling recipes and publishing books to raise money for the war effort, including the Patriotic Society, Women's Society of Bracebridge, which had all kinds of things you could cook up for your family at home or to ship overseas to the soldiers with alternate ingredients. So that capacity of women to be innovative and respond in a time of necessity with whatever was available was brought to the forefront in Muskoka. In addition, there was a huge way of getting food supplied by, for example, meat was provided by the government opening hunting in Algonquin Park. And men who were great shots, marksmen, but didn't qualify to go overseas. Maybe they were serving as part of a home guard, but they went hunting and felled all sorts of deer in Algonquin Park. And here's a picture of a woman loading the carcasses up at one of the lodges near Algonquin Park onto a wagon that would then go to a slaughterhouse and be dressed as venison, cuts of venison, to supply the home front for its protein needs in the form of meat. The nurses of Muskoka, over 24 nurses, were an interesting example of how a lot of women were seeking to be more adventuresome and found that war offered an outlet for more unrestrained engagement with life. 2,333 Canadian registered nurses went overseas in the First World War. That's 1/4 of Canada's nurses at that time. And primarily they were serving at stationary hospitals, field hospitals, and frontline clearing stations, triage at the battlefront, administering anesthetics, morphine, dressing wounds, and dealing with the very grisly business of men maimed and mangled and badly wounded through the war of attrition that was being waged on the Western Front. The war of attrition was Field Marshal Haig's approach to battle. The French followed the same approach, which was to draw on their colonies for all the soldiers they could possibly need and continue to flow them through to attack the German lines, which were generally better positioned and with well-installed machine guns and artillery, to mow down these colonials as they were charging, along with British citizens in their own army. And it was just a devastating war of attrition. The front lines barely moved. Advances were lost, gained one day and lost the next day. Well, the nurses were there, and that included the Berg family from Bracebridge had their youngest daughter, the Berg family that ran the woolen mill, 3 daughters, and the youngest, May, enrolled in overseas service as soon as the war broke out. And she was not only in France, but she served in Egypt and in Russia. And later, when Henry Bird opened the Muskoka room in London to facilitate hospitality and support for all Muskokans, any Muskokans who were in London, England, in relation to the war, soldiers and others, they were welcome there. And the other 2 daughters of the Berg family went overseas and lived in London for the war, running that the Muskoka rooms. So there were a lot of venturesome women who went abroad as nurses, and many were killed when hospitals near the front were bombed, when hospital ships were torpedoed. They went down along with their patients. So it was not falling to all Muskoka's women to be able to go overseas. A lot of those in nursing were daughters of more privileged families in a way, and most of the women of Muskoka devoted their energies to what they could do locally through the Red Cross chapters that were formed across the district, through the Karki Club, which allowed them to, as one woman from Huntsville said, have direct contact with the soldiers, not mediated between larger associations as even the Red Cross clearinghouses were. And direct contact was the key. Women were now engaging directly and wanted to be involved directly. So those are some of the ways that I describe in the book that show how women were responding. They assisted also in the recruitment of more soldiers. Sometimes it was a woman who'd watched young lads grow up and knew them well, simply saying, putting the right word in a young man's ear at the right time to persuade him that it really was his duty to go overseas and fight to protect the country and the families of Canada from the barbarous Hun who was attacking without conscience and committing all sorts of atrocities. Much of that fueled, of course, by British propaganda during the war. And also there was censorship at the time of war, so the true picture of what was happening was always being filtered through a couple of in a couple of ways, propaganda enhancing versions of what was going on, and censorship excluding versions of what was really going on. So here on the home front, support continued. The truth was really not well understood about the conditions that men were in. As Lou Mackenzie, a lot of you remember Major General Mackenzie when he lived in Muskoka and ran for Parliament for us. Didn't win, but he was a great Canadian soldier. He told me one time, Patrick, if there'd been television cameras along in the trenches of the Western Front, that war would have been over in a month. Instead, it went on for 4 years. But as the women continued to support the effort in the war, they found all these new channels that enabled them to take more control. And that included with the Women's Institutes, which had been formed to support particularly farm women in education and training that had not existed before. Directly, Women for Women. They were organized under the Ontario Department of Agriculture. There was also the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Women who were seeking prohibition of alcohol because of the huge social problems being created by booze in society. Basically, husbands and fathers coming home after work on payday, having stopped at the tavern en route with little money left, but aggressive in their behavior, which had led to beatings of wives and children going hungry. The drive for prohibition didn't come out of a vacuum. It came out of real social urgency felt by many women. And they succeeded by 1920 in Muskokas across the country and the province, getting prohibition brought in at the provincial level as well as municipally. And in the United States, the same thing, made under the Constitution of the United States, bringing in the Prohibition era of the 1920s. Turned out ultimately to be a failed experiment, but it showed that women were having new clout and new power to deliver on social policies that they believed were necessary to improve their condition and uphold the well-being of their families. All of this came out of the Great War, and it's one of the reasons why, when we want to understand how we are today, we must look back at that time. By the time of the Second World War, women were being recruited for roles within the armed forces. There were special sections of the armed forces for women. After 1984, when I was chairing a parliamentary committee on equality rights, Article 15 of the Charter, we recommended complete opening of Canadian forces to women in all roles. Up until then, combat roles and several others had been excluded to women. That is now at an end. And we even see today in the command structures of our country a woman as commissioner of the RCMP. All of these things you can trace back to the fundamental shift that occurred between 1914 and 1918. And in this, the women of Muskoka were not bystanders. They were not incidental beneficiaries of action being taken by others in different parts of the country. They were part and parcel of the drive to deliver a better day for women in Canadian society. I'm Patrick Boyer, speaking to you from the Bracebridge Public Library about the role of Muskoka's women in times of war.